Good morning. All right, so we've been studying in the first principles in our Sunday school. And we've been going through these different things, really kind of using Acts as a basis. And last week we looked at Acts chapter 1. We'll start there again today, but in Acts chapter 1, just kind of opens up with Jesus being alive. And so last week we spent our Sunday school class talking about that first principle, just the reality that Jesus was risen from the dead. And we looked at some things like, when they needed to choose a new apostle to fill the role of Judas, they said one of the things that he's going to need to do is be a witness for the resurrection of Jesus. And we went through all these different speeches in Acts where, Peter and Paul were sharing the gospel with these various groups. And what we saw as a common theme is just their emphasis that Jesus was risen from the dead. So that was what we spent last week looking at, just this idea. Again, this was a truth that was really going to change their message. When they were, the last time we saw the apostles in the Gospels, Jesus was alive as sort of a mortal man, and then he was crucified, and now he's died. He's back to life, and that's going to be a big theme that they talk about. Today, I'm going to kind of continue a little bit on that subject and talk again, looking at Acts as a starting point. It's just talking about that sort of intermediary period where Jesus was raised from the dead. He's alive, and then he's on the earth for, it tells us in Acts chapter 1, 40 days. And just looking at some of the things that we learn about during that time period. And each of the Gospels gives us a little bit of a different perspective. We're going to use Luke's perspective as our touching point. Just kind of look at some of those things, or what are some of the truths that we learn, and what are some of the things that really maybe make us think as believers about that time that when Jesus was risen before he ascends into the ascends to be at his Father's right hand. So if just flipping back, let's start at Luke chapter 24. If it's not too much, Brad, would you mind reading maybe those 12 verses, that reading for us?
Okay. Now upon the first day of the week, very early in the morning, they came unto the sepulchre, bringing the spices which they had prepared, and certain others with them. And they found the stone rolled away from the sepulchre. They entered in and found not the body of the Lord Jesus. It came to pass, as they were much perplexed thereabout, behold, two men stood by them in shining garments. As they were afraid and bowed down their faces to the earth, they said unto them, Why do you seek the living among the dead? He is not here, but is risen. Remember how he spoke to you when he was yet in Galilee, saying, The Son of Man must be delivered into the hands of sinful men and be crucified, and the third day rise again. And they remembered his words, and returned from the sepulchre, and told all these things unto the 11 and to all the rest. It was Mary Magdalene, and Joanna, and Mary the mother of James, and other women that were with them, which told these things unto the apostles. And their words seemed to them as idle tales, and they believed them not. Then arose Peter and ran unto the sepulchre, and stooping down, he beheld the linen clothes laid by themselves, and departed, wondering in himself at that which was to come to pass. That which was come to pass.
Thank you, Brad. So, here's the first account where they realize that Jesus is not in their tomb. And so this is kind of a big shock for this group of people, and even a shock for his disciples. In some ways, it's kind of strange, right? Because even during his ministry, this is something he told them, right? We can look at some references. We won't, but this is something that Jesus had told them, but for some reason, it just didn't get through. And I guess we're probably the same way. And maybe there's things that it just doesn't. We can't wrap our minds around it. We just don't digest it. We just we get the idea that the disciples kind of had in their mind that Jesus would become this king. He would go to Jerusalem, and he would transition into this king on David's throne, and that the kingdom would start shortly. But what we see that didn't happen, that kind of threw them for a loop, and they're in this sort of state of confusion here for a couple of days. And then to add more to their confusion, they go to the tomb, and Jesus isn't there. And the response we hear is everybody is a little bit shocked. And so that's how we first hear about the rising of Jesus. And it's just interesting, you know, the writer points out a few details, or what are some of the little details that they see that seem off to them? What is it? What are some of the details that they came that it's like, oh wait, something's going on here. This isn't right. The body's not there. That's the big one. Yeah, Jesus is gone. The stone is rolled away. Yeah, that's kind of mentioned more in the account in John's gospel. Yeah, I've talked about the yeah.
Well, the first thing jumps out of my mind, and that they dismissed immediately, was the women who said they've seen him.
Yeah.
They totally dismissed it, and there must have been a euphoria about Mary, you know, in a way that, you know, if we had seen the Lord Jesus, everything would have changed. But it's amazing the way they dismissed it as not even, well, let's go see what you're talking about, or this could be good, you know.
Yeah.
But then they looked at it like grave robbers had come. That's where they went to. Somebody's robbed the body.
Yeah, and that's interesting because and the other big thing. Oh, go ahead, Rob.
Sorry, Jason. I find it funny too is, you know, he's clearly said this to them that he's going to raise on the third day, and it makes you wonder, like, were there things that they just couldn't wrap their heads around and that they almost just dismissed and like, oh, okay, Jesus, you know, because it's like, I don't think they would have forgotten him saying that. So maybe like when they say they remembered his saying, when they say that, maybe it means that they remember it and now see it and connect it, right? Like, in other words, because you don't really be like, oh yeah, he did say that. He did say he was going to raise on the third day. No wonder, you know, like that's the way the account kind of reads. But I kind of feel like maybe the word remember there means that, like, you know, now they connect it all and believe what he said. So that's kind of an aside, but I found it interesting.
I think. Okay.
Kind of on a related note, what's always stuck out to me in this account is, you know, there's a principle throughout the Bible that God uses effectively the lower things to confound the mightier things, right? And societally at this point, women really had no place to speak or lead, and it's Jesus, it's these women that Jesus chose to be the first people to proclaim the gospel of Jesus's rise from the dead. And I think that's an important highlight on the honor that he gave these faithful women at a time when his apostles lost their faith. So definitely a lesson, I think, for all of us.
One of the most interesting, glaring things that's missing is Pilate went through such effort, because everybody said this guy's going to rise on the third day. He put guards and people in places that ain't going to happen. And when they come to the tomb, there is no guard, there's no one there, and no matter what the men of the world try to accomplish, it still happened.
Yeah, so there's a lot of these events.
There were a couple of angels there, and that's when it says they fell down in fright when they saw these gleaming angels. And, you know, whenever I read something like that, the fear component always strikes me. We get that through the Bible, that somebody sees an angel or something to that effect, and their immediate reaction is falling down in fear. And I wonder, you know, it seems like today we're so inundated with shocking images and we hear shocking things, that we're not shocked by anything anymore. And it makes me wonder what it's going to take for me to fall down in fear at Christ's return. What am I going to see or hear that's going to be something I haven't experienced in some way before and just gone, yeah, yeah?
Something else as I was reading through this, it's kind of a harbinger for our, for our future. We look at it and where it says Peter, this is verse 12, he's walked with Jesus. He's been told, as you mentioned many times, I'm going to die and be raised on the third day, and even so I'll meet you, and then I'll meet you, Jerusalem. And it says Peter's looking at it, an open tomb, strips of linen, and it might be a translation issue, but it says, and he went away wondering to himself what happened. We believe Jesus is coming back. If we don't have the expectation firmly in our minds, if we don't constantly feed it, what are we going to be wondering when Jesus comes back? When we see the things happening just before he comes back, are we watching for it? Or we could be going, what's going on with the rest of the world? So I think it's a strong lesson for us.
So one of the things that struck me, we kind of talked about the women, and again, the point has already been made, is that when they came back and they shared this news, at least my version, it says something like, their words seemed like an idle tale. And so they didn't take them very seriously. But it's interesting, this isn't the only time in Scripture where there have been women who've witnessed to something like this, and then they weren't really taken seriously. Just throwing that out there. Does anybody think of any other examples? Yes.
What was said, and he said, when the angel appeared back, the angel said, well, I already told your wife. Listen to her. Yeah.
Yeah, Manoah's wife was, he didn't believe his wife.
Get over it, man. Well, you would have killed us already.
Yeah, she's the one that sort of, yeah.
They had the reasoning.
Yeah, absolutely.
When Mary, the mother of Jesus, was told she was going to have a son, people didn't believe that an angel had told her.
If somebody here came to you and said, yeah, an angel told me whatever, you're going to go, oh, uh-huh. I think that skepticism, when it's secondhand, is completely understandable.
And then for Joseph, and that's why my girlfriend's pregnant, right? I mean, that's even more of a far-fetched.
If you think about it, lots of times we see the contrast between a Jewish response to the things of God versus the Gentile response. And so we look on the flip side, when Jesus spoke to the woman at the well, who was probably a woman not of high standing, she goes back to the town and they believe her. And they all come running out to Jesus. So we have the flip side of it.
The Apostle Paul talked about, it doesn't say it about men, but it says about women who are idle, they become talebearers and things like that. So maybe this was something that was much more rampant in that day, that he didn't say men are being talebearers, but that it focused on women to, be married and busy and with their hands. So this could have been some culture that was strong there, to where women were just not as taken for seriousness as much as we would maybe take them today. I just throw that out there too.
A delayed comment from Brother Paul Martin. he said that they were devastated and scared, and they thought, like everyone else, that the kingdom was going to be in their time. And here he is, here's his tomb, and he's gone, and what happened to the kingdom?
Absolutely. Yeah, their minds were just kind of blown. I think, yeah, people point out they kind of had, and that's how we are too. You know, we kind of sometimes hear what we want to hear that fits kind of our worldview, and then something happens, and okay, wait a minute. I'd also throw out Rhoda. You remember when Peter was released from jail by that angel, and he came back, and he knocks on the door, and she leaves him standing and comes in, and no one believes her either. She's like, so. But yeah, these are some spiritual men that had to learn to maybe value their sisters a little more than they were. So, all right. So the other thing that kind of comes up again, there's angels here present. Each of the gospel narratives talks about the angels, and it's interesting. How are their angels described in this narrative? And let me put it another way: were they even called angels? We kind of jumped to some conclusions, right? Yeah, there are two men who stood by them in dazzling. Now, when you cross-reference other ones, you'll see that they are called angels, but it's interesting that, you know, that first thing that appears is that they look like, and I think is it the Matthew narrative where it talks about a young man, I think is that term, I can't recall, but that's how they're described, as looking like men. You know, I know around Christmas time, actually more it would be Easter time, but whenever you see the artist depiction of this, what are they seeing? This angel with this huge wingspan, you know, but this is they look like two men. And then they're talking about dazzling apparel. And again, when we hear about this dazzling white apparel, what does that kind of bring our minds to? Another incident that happened in Jesus's, the Transfiguration. You know, it's, and again, we won't look at it, you know, it's in Matthew 17 where Jesus says there's some standing here who won't taste death till they see the kingdom coming in power, and then he transfigures and becomes brilliant white. And here we see the angels depicting that same thing, getting this idea of, I don't know, this sort of divine glory that's demonstrated by this bright, dazzling whiteness.
That point there you just made, that you won't see death until you see the glory, they may have confused that with, I'm not going to die, and the kingdom's going to be established. And they could, of course, that was one spectacular event that they experienced, and Jesus said, we won't see death. You know, so they may not have fully grasped that they were seeing a shadow of the kingdom, not the literal kingdom. Of course, remember, they were debating amongst each other who was going to lead with Jesus, which means they weren't planning to die before that happened. You know, so all those things were going through their mind of setting up the kingdom and overthrow, you know, and having the power to sit by Jesus and things like that. And all of a sudden that was dashed and seemed impossible to happen now.
The other thing is just interesting too is that, you know, here we are at the resurrection of Jesus, and there's angels are the first thing that we see. But again, when you look through a lot of the teachings of Jesus about angels and the resurrection, what are some of the things that Jesus talks about? What kind of role are the angels going to play in the resurrection to come? I have a few passages we can look at just to kind of start the ball rolling. Maybe look at Matthew chapter 22, verse 30. Um, 22, verse 30, please.
For in the resurrection they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but as the angels of God in heaven.
So, again, the wider context, he's trying to, having this discussion with these Sadducees who don't believe in a resurrection, and Jesus is teaching them, you know, they're trying to trap them with this question about marriage. But anyway, one of the little nuggets that comes out here is that in the resurrection, they'll be like the angels. And so that's kind of an interesting little thing to think about, that this is, they show us a little bit about what believers will be like in the resurrection. Matthew chapter 24, verse 31 gives another and again, you see this in a lot of his parables, but we'll just look at this one here. Maybe verses 30 and 31 for context.
All right. At that time, the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, and all the nations of the earth will mourn. They will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory. And he will send his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of the heavens to the other.
That's here Jesus talking about his return. What he's going to do is he's going to send out the angels to gather the elect. So that's one of the things that they'll do at the return of Christ. And again, we can look at Matthew chapter 13 as well, verse 49. And maybe verses 47 to 50 for context.
You said Matthew 13, 47 to 50, right?
Yes, please.
Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a net that was thrown into the sea and gathered fish of every kind. When it was full, men drew it ashore and sat down and sorted the good into containers and threw away the bad. So it will be at the end of the age. The angels will come out and separate the evil from the righteous and throw them into the fiery furnace. In that place, there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth.
So, again, he kind of talked about the angels being involved in the process of separating the good from the evil in the kingdom age. So, and there's other places we could look, but I think those kind of make the point that, here we have Jesus raised from the dead, and the first thing they see is a couple of angels. But just interesting, even in his second coming with the resurrection in general, the angels will play a very involved role, and we see that in several of his teachings. All right, so that's kind of the first thing that happens. The women go to the tomb and they find it empty. They find these angels. And then the next thing in Luke's narrative, you have these two guys that are traveling and they come across Jesus. We're going to go ahead and read that narrative and talk through that. Luke chapter 24, verses 13 to 35. And feel free to split that up if you feel. Luke chapter 24, verses 13 through 35.
And two of them were going that very day to a village named Emmaus, which was 60 furlongs from Jerusalem. And they discussed with each other about all the things which had happened. And it came to pass, while they talked and questioned each other, that Jesus himself drew near and went with them. But their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he said to them, "What communications are these that you have one with another as you walk?" And they stood still, looking sad. And one of them, named Cleopas, answered and said to him, "Do you live alone in Jerusalem, and therefore do not know the things which have happened there recently?"
And he said to them, "What things?" And they said to him, "Concerning Jesus of Nazareth, the man who was prophet, mighty indeed, and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and rulers delivered him up to the condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all this, it is now the third day since these things happened. Moreover, some women of our company amazed us. They were at the tomb early in the morning, and when they did not find his body, they came back to say that they had even seen a vision of an angel who said that he was alive. Some of those were with us when went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but him they did not see." Said 24?
35 is where this reading ends.
And he said to them, O foolish ones, and slow of heart to believe that all the prophets have spoken. Was it not necessary that the Christ could suffer these things and enter into his glory? And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them, thank you, to them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. So they drew near to the village to which they were going. He acted as if he were going farther, but they urged him strongly, saying, "Stay with us, for it is toward the evening, and day is now far spent." So he went in to stay with them. When he was at the table with them, he took the bread and blessed and broke it and gave it to them. And their eyes were open. They recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. They said to each other, "Did not our hearts burn with us while he talked to us on the road, while he opened to us the scriptures?" And they rose at the same hour and returned to Jerusalem. And they found that the 11 and those who were with them gathered together, saying, "The Lord has risen indeed and has appeared to Simon." Then they told what had happened on the road and how he was known to them in the breaking of the bread.
Thank you. So again, we have in Luke's gospel, at least, some of the other gospels put a little timeline differently, but Luke's gospel, this is the first time where we read about Jesus himself making contact, having been risen from the dead, with some of his disciples. And we have Cleopas and his friend walking away from Jerusalem and talking about all these things that are happening, and then Jesus kind of walks among them. It's interesting that they can't recognize Jesus for whatever reason. They're prevented from knowing who he was and being able to recognize him as Jesus, at least initially. And like the other disciples, they're still kind of in wonder and confusion about what's happened. And they kind of recount all the things that have happened. And like the other disciples, they've heard the testimony of these women, but they're still not sure about things. Right? They didn't give them, they didn't take it at face value. And so anyway, Jesus meets with them, and after talking with them, he gets kind of frustrated a little bit. This really is strong language if you think about this. Can you imagine maybe a brother who's a speaker at a Bible school or something, getting frustrated? Foolish people, how slow, But Jesus really is, but that's what he says, "Oh, foolish ones and slow of heart." And he really does express his frustration with them that they really didn't pick up on this message that he had taught them over and over again. And it's just kind of interesting. Yeah, go ahead.
This is the second instance after his resurrection where Jesus plays dumb, right? So Jesus with Mary asks, well, who are you looking for, right? Obviously knowing what the answer to the question is, but just trying to draw out from her what she is thinking and to reveal what her thinking is. He does the same thing to these men here. Well, what things? What things? Of course he knew what things because he was center of it, but he asked them to draw out from them what they knew, what they thought, and then with disappointment, has to explain.
What Jason said, similar to what God asked Adam. Have you eaten of the tree? As if, inform me what you've done. Tell me what you've done. It's just like that.
Yeah, it's a very, very interesting way in how he chooses to approach people after he comes back. And but one of the things he does is that he expresses his frustration. But we see one of the things he does is he uses this time to teach them. And again, there's that expression that he, verse 27, where it says, "Beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted them all the scriptures and things concerning himself." And we'll kind of see that same thing is echoed again when he meets with his disciples at the end of the chapter. So it's just kind of interesting. One of the things that Jesus does during this 40 days is teach his disciples, and continue to teach them more fully open their eyes, so to speak. It's like this, they sort of didn't grasp everything, and now he's alive, and here he is, and now it's like he can finally work with him. He can finally explain what this really means, and it's going to stick a little better than maybe it did during his ministry before he was crucified.
It's easy to read tone the way that we're used to reading it, and I've always read it that same way. You know, every time Jesus says something like this, it's easy to see it as frustration. But remember, Jesus is perfect here, and Jesus also knows. He knows, and he knows where they're going to be 6 months down the road and 10 years down the road. And I think if you just read it with a different tone of voice, you get a really different message. As you know, just not rather than, oh, you're so foolish. Sort of like, oh, you still don't get it, do you? That's okay. I'll teach you. And to me, that is comforting. A little scary to think about Jesus being frustrated with me, as deserving as I am of that. It's comforting to think that he kind of shaking his head a little bit, but he knows. He gets it.
That's a good point. We have that conversation at work with people when communications of email sometimes get perceived the wrong way, and it's like, you know, sometimes our tone doesn't come through, and you're right. It is true. It depends on how you read that. You can really get kind of a different perspective.
So after knowing everything that he told them to look for and to anticipate with regards to him, I think the biggest question that he's asking them is, were you looking for me? Are you looking for me? And I think that's something that we need to take to heart, because we get distracted in our day-to-day stuff, and we know that the Lord's going to return. We know what the promises are. We know what we're supposed to anticipate and to be excited about. And the question becomes, are we looking for him? Because if we were looking for him, would we be meeting those testimonies with skepticism or doubt? Or would we be excited and embracing it and rushing off to see where he was sighted? Something to think about.
I think it's also important to note that he kind of gives them the model of what they're to do moving forward by breaking bread with him, and then he leaves. So basically his understanding, you know, if you look at the account we read every Sunday, he probably said along the same lines that he gave to Paul in the Corinthians, is do this in remembrance of me until I return, you know, because their fear was the kingdom's not here, you know, he's not going to set up the kingdom, he's not going to redeem Israel. It's like, this is what you need to do until I return. And that was the last thing that needed to happen for their eyes to be completely open. And then his work there was done. So it kind of provides the model also that he's leading by example of what his disciples will be doing when he leaves as well.
Yeah, you're right. And I put the question there, I don't know the answer, but it's like at that point, Jesus is breaking the bread. It says their eyes were opened, and then he disappears. You know, it's like, you know, and what's the significance of why when that happens? And you know, we don't know exactly who these two guys are, but maybe they were there at that upper room. I don't know. Maybe not. I mean, it's
Sorry. So it's also noteworthy because you think about the 40 days he was there, and you know, you figure his whole ministry, he's got crowds, masses gathering around him all the time. But then he disappears from there. He goes through a wall. In another account, like he goes through you know, you see these kind of supernatural kind of occurrences. So it kind of answers the question, how did he avoid the masses? How did he hang around for 40 days without thousands of people mobbing him, you know? So I thought that was interesting as well, because I hadn't remembered that this account where he had disappeared from them as well.
I also wonder, it says that he used all the scriptures in the Old Testament to explain about him. I would love to have something recorded. Not that I don't believe it, but that there are things that Jesus would have thought were really important that point to him from the Old Testament. And he used those things in order to talk to these two men from Emmaus. He uses these things potentially to talk to Paul or Saul at the time when he has his conversion. You'd like to know what they were, because if they were important to Jesus, but they're unrecorded, they're unsaid, it's like something gap, it's missing.
Well, so at the end of this, after Jesus disappears, they make a comment that, wasn't our hearts burning within us? That's kind of an interesting point. You kind of just not sure what to take from that, but it's almost like there was something they could sense was special about this guy, and they could just feel it inside them. And until he was open their eyes, it's like, now we understand why we felt this way. Jesus was walking with us. I don't know, but it is an interesting comment that they make, that there was like something like our hearts were burning within us when this guy was speaking, and we just couldn't put our finger on it, but now we get it. This was Jesus himself appearing to us. Back in the Old Testament, Jeremiah, when he, just as a cross-reference, Jeremiah chapter 20, verse 9, verse 9.
Then I said, I will not make mention of him, nor speak any more of his name. But his word was in mine heart as a burning fire, and shut up in my bones, and I was weary with forbearing, and I could not stay.
Jeremiah is just kind of describing, he'd been given this message by God through the Spirit, and it was just inside of him, and he like burning, like it needed to get out. And you think about, here's the Word made flesh walking with them, and they kind of have that same feeling in their hearts. But very interesting interaction that takes place here with Jesus and these two guys. I think somebody else mentioned it as well, but when Jesus met with Mary Magdalene at first, it was sort of a similar thing. He didn't reveal himself right away. If you look at John chapter 20, verse 16, really,
Jesus said unto her, Mary. She turned herself and said to him, Rabboni, which is to say, Master.
so originally she thinks this is a gardener, and then it's like something in that word he said, something snapped and her eyes opened and she knew it was Jesus. And again, it's very similar to what we just read with these guys. It's like he breaks this bread, blesses and breaks the bread, and then it's like their eyes open up and it's like, oh wait, this is Jesus. And same thing with Mary, she was not told to cling to him just yet. And with these guys, he just kind of disappears and he's gone. So,
is the way that Jesus first appears is as a humble gardener, a gardener. Here's the King of King and Lord of Lords, and his first appearance is taken as a gardener. And then on this road to Emmaus, he's a stranger. On the road, it just walks up and says, hey guys, what are you talking about? The King of Kings and Lord of Lords is how he came in. So even humbly into his new position. There's something to think about why they wouldn't have said, oh, Jesus, hey, just things to think about that recently was brought to my attention of how he appeared first to the world. So.
Couple of things from Brother Paul Martin I share with you. So he was talking about the way Jesus is teaching. He says this method's called guided discovery. He tells us the easiest thing to do is to give somebody the answer. But if you show them how to answer for themselves, they'll be able to understand and teach others and share it with them. So he's still teaching them and preparing them for their mission. He also noted that Adam was supposedly, supposed to be a gardener as well. And the other thing about John 20 that I've always found interesting is we constantly read about how Christ knows who his are. He knows his sheep, he knows who are. Isn't it interesting here? It's not until he calls her name that she recognizes, I'm one of your sheep. I know who you are.
Yeah. Thank you, Walter. Thank you, Brother Paul, as well. Yeah, that's true. Think about that, but that's how the disciples, they're going to be teaching people eventually, and they have to learn how to do that as well, not just understand it themselves. So that's a very good point. All right, so it looks like we're done, but I don't see the kids, so I had another reading I wanted to read, so I didn't want to start reading unless we're, there's, okay. What I want to do is I want to finish off the rest of Luke, so maybe we'll set that for next week. And then my hope was to kind of, again, follow where we were going in Acts. So in Acts, it's like Jesus is alive, Jesus is there 40 days, and then he ascends, and then there's kind of this message about his coming. So that was what I was hoping to touch on next, but I'll touch base. I don't know what's planned in the classes, so yes.
Well, we have 1 minute then. And maybe you talked about this sometime over the last couple of weeks and I missed it. But back at his crucifixion, Matthew 27:52 is a verse that is really weird. And it's the only time it's mentioned. It says, the tombs were broken open, the bodies of many holy people who had died were raised to life. And they came out of the tombs after Jesus' resurrection and went into the holy city and appeared to many people. Well, what kind of weird stuff is that? Who were these people? What did they do? How long were they out there? And then what happened to them? And man, anybody have any thoughts on that? Because this is all happening during that same period that Jesus is appearing to people.
Yeah, you don't really do it justice unless you put all four of the Gospels together, because there's all these different, it's just a lot happening, right? You got the guard at the tomb, you got these people coming back to life, people seeing Jesus. Thank you. Goodbye.